This week in the Psychology of Education, conceptual change. In this lecture, I'm going to talk about the difference between conceptual change and conceptual growth, provide a bunch of different examples of conceptual change, and some strategies that teachers can use that have been supported in the research to support conceptual change in your students. Let's get started. Okay, so to start out, what is a concept? These are also referred to sometimes as a mental model. When I talk about concept, I mean a mental representation that categorizes, classifies, or organizes information about the world and how things work. You might have a concept about, let's give a few examples. So this week, I'm asking you to take a look at the 1619 project or the 2C project. So those are concepts about, for instance, the founding of the US. Concepts about climate change. You may have concepts about what makes a planet. You may have concepts about gravity. Much of what you learn about in school are concepts. You have concepts about addition and subtraction, concepts about let's say trigonometry or how you calculate angles. These are organizing principles that you use to make sense of the world. Now, those concepts are not always right, and so we may need to engage in conceptual change. This is a process by which your central organizing concepts change from one set to another, and that those sets are incompatible. So for instance, I may change from thinking climate change is not man-made to thinking climate change is man-made. I may go from thinking the US, the most important date in the founding of the US was 1776, to thinking the most important date in the founding of the US was 1619. So I'm making a shift. Another example would be young children often have the misconception that a birthday party makes somebody older and that you become older by having a birthday party. We of course know that that's not true. And so there's a shift. We essentially have to cross off that idea and replace it with something else, which is you age irregardless of whether you have a birthday party. Another misconception related to this class in particular is that some people think that learning styles are one of the most important individual differences in terms of student learning and helping student success. And actually, the research suggests that there's no evidence in support that matching your learning to your learning style is effective for learning. So if you don't know this, check out the module on study strategies around this. So there may be things, and a lot of things, we don't want to have conceptual change all the time. We don't want to have to keep essentially crossing out one thing and switching with another. We most of the time want to be, as teachers, building correct knowledge. Conceptual change requires that there was a misconception, that you're essentially revising or fixing that misconception, but we often want our students to engage in conceptual growth. This is just the process of adding to or expanding on our concepts in ways that make them more complex or sophisticated. So you learn addition with single-digit numbers, then you learn addition with two-digit numbers. You hopefully aren't having to essentially revise your understanding, but you're growing that understanding. You're making it more complex, more sophisticated, more elaborate. You may then start doing addition with positive and negative numbers. And so you keep sort of adding, and maybe you aren't necessarily having to revise your conceptualization. So here are two graphs. These are by researchers Karl Popper and I believe, Thomas Kuhn, about how science itself evolves. And this idea of conceptual change actually came out of the idea of science, the history of science and how scientists change their ideas over time. And so Popper said that essentially scientific progress just builds on itself over time. One by kind of just goes along. We just keep learning and building and building. And Kuhn said we build some knowledge, but then eventually we get to a point where we are like, wait a second, our theory doesn't fit, our mental model doesn't fit. And so we have to go back down and start mental model number 2. And we build mental model number 2 for a while, but then we're like, hey, I don't understand this, my data don't fit. And so I've got to try again, make a new theory and start to build that theory up. And so we might think about these as conceptual change, this sort of additive process, keep building your knowledge, versus conceptual change, which is this constant process of like you're building, but then the conceptual change is that you're revising and starting over with a new mental model. I'm going to talk now about some examples of understanding the shape of the Earth. This is something that's really challenging for young kids and actually some adults as well. So there's a study, this is a really groundbreaking study in the early 90s, where they interviewed kids and they asked kids to draw the Earth, and they showed them, they essentially were giving them ways of telling the adult interviewer, what do you think the shape of the Earth is? What is your mental model of the Earth? And they came up with all these different categories that described children's ways. Of course, we want them to be thinking of the Earth like a sphere. But the idea is not that you essentially have there's one incorrect model, but that there's a lot of incorrect models, and that essentially we kind of change over time and kind of like, okay, this one is more sophisticated than the last. And eventually we make our way up to the top. So we're kind of like in this process of going up here. And so when they looked at first and through fifth graders, what they found was, and I'm just showing the first and fifth grade data here, is that by fifth grade, most of the kids said that the Earth was shaped like a sphere. This meant that all of their interviews and their drawings and everything was depicting the Earth like a sphere. We still have some of the kids following this hollow sphere, which is this one here. So they sort of described the Earth as a sphere, but they talk about people being sort of standing up straight in the middle. However, the first graders were really divided among these different models. These are only samples of 20 kids in each grade, but you can see the difference between first and fifth grade, where we're sort of shifting up towards these more sophisticated sphere, flattened sphere, hollow Earth from these sort of other types of models. And so the theory of conceptual change that's put forward in the literature is this idea that we get new information and we have to decide what to do with it. And so essentially asking yourself all the time, and this may be a sort of at a subconscious level of, do I think the information fits my current mental model? And if I say yes, then I just assimilate that new information, and this is conceptual growth. So if I have a theory that four-legged creatures are dogs, and I go out on a walk and I see a new four-legged creature and it barks, and I say, oh, okay, this new information fits my mental model that four-legged creatures are dogs, then I assimilate this, and maybe I now have this more robust concept of dogs that includes poodles and includes chihuahuas and bulldogs and all other sorts of dogs. And if I if I get some new information and I am asking myself, does it fit my current mental model? My answer is no. I can do a couple of different things. One is that I can reject this new information. I can just essentially ignore it. We might see this if you're trying to convince someone and you think you've presented them with a really good argument that would contradict their beliefs, but they just kind of say, actually, yeah, I don't believe that, or that doesn't jive with me. I'm just going to kind of ignore the fact that that's there. You might, with the new information, I think it doesn't fit my current model. Maybe I'm going to create some sort of new unrelated mental model. So with my dog example, let's say I go to a petting zoo and I see a goat and it goes bah. And so I think as a child, I'm thinking like, oh, I have this schema, four-legged creatures are dogs, and there's barky dogs and there's dogs that make this other sound. And so I have some sort of new unrelated mental model. I'm still thinking four-legged creatures are dogs, but I've like kind of put this goat thing on the other side. I can also then say, no, this information doesn't fit my current mental model, and I'm going to completely restructure my knowledge. And so maybe it's not, a goat isn't a dog. And I think like, oh, okay, I've got to like re-understand that not all four-legged creatures are dogs. And so I've changed my conceptions. To give another visual of this, let's say you have this mental model that has these two distinct categories, and you get this new idea and you're like, what do I do with this? Essentially, there's a couple options. You could assimilate it into an existing category. So we've kind of got small shapes and big shapes, and this one kind of fits in the big shape category. We could create a new category for it, sort of leave it off to its own. Or we could completely revise our category and say, instead of sides of shapes, we're going to use actual like sort of shapiness as our category. To end today, two ways that teachers can support conceptual change in their students. I'm going to mention refutation text and teaching for transformative experience. Refutation text, you probably know because you've been asked to do this in persuasive writing. Refutation text essentially has three parts. The first part is stating the misconception. Here, the misconception that people believe that a camel stores water in its hump, and that the hump gets smaller because the camel uses up the water that's in its hump. So stating the misconception. The second part is a refutation cue, but this isn't true. Actually, other sorts of words or phrases that would give you a clue that this misconception is not right. And then it ends with the refutation with the current accepted explanation. Actually, the hump stores fat and grows smaller if the camel hasn't eaten for a long time. It's actually not water. And so this might be, you might have used this in persuasive writing. You may see this done in persuasive writing, and I'll be curious whether you see this in the 1619 project or the 2C project. And so refutation text has been found to increase the likelihood of acceptance of the new conceptions across a whole bunch of ages of students. If you have textbooks in college, especially in science classes, I'm going to bet you that you will see refutation text sprinkled throughout your book to try to help change your mind. One other method that's been shown within science is this idea of teaching for transformative experience. This model essentially has three different steps. The first step is to frame the concept in terms of its value. Why is this new idea useful? So if I want you to think about evolution as sort of a product of natural selection, I need to sort of convince you, why is that useful for you? If I want to convince you that climate change is man-made, why is new conceptualization useful? Well, it's useful because we can actually do something about it. It's useful because it's going to help the evolution, for instance. It's useful because it's going to help us understand antibiotic resistance. Understanding that birthday parties don't cause you to get older could be useful because you're not going to have a birthday party on your birthday this year. The second step is to model a transformative experience. This is the teacher modeling your own transformative experience. Well, I also used to think that birthday parties cause you to get older. But actually, let me tell you about an experience that changed my mind on this topic. I once, when I was 6 years old, I had 5 birthday parties because my parents were divorced and my grandparents had to come a different day. And so maybe you're sharing an experience of how you didn't suddenly become much older as a result of having all these birthday parties. The third step is scaffolding students' re-seeing, helping them to connect their own experiences and understanding as example of the new conceptualization. So getting students to volunteer examples, to share their ideas, to read new things, watch new things, go out to museums or other sorts of experiences that will allow them opportunities to see this new concept in action. And you as the teacher scaffolding or providing some supports for students to see that this new conceptualization actually is a better representation of their understanding. And so there's a bunch more ways that we can teach for conceptual change and rhetorical strategies that we can use. So we're going to take a deep dive into some examples this week, and I encourage you to take a look as you're learning in your different classes. In what ways are your teachers asking you to engage in conceptual growth? And in what ways are they asking you to engage in conceptual change? And then how? If they're asking you to engage in conceptual change, how are they trying to get you to change your mind?